Hello, good evening, and welcome to Resetting the Table, episode 3 with the Anthropologists. My name is Melissa Machito. I am the founding artistic director of the Anthropologists, and I am so pleased to be here with you all tonight and to be joined by a really phenomenal uh, guest tonight. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you a few things about this series and about the Anthropologists. We were founded 13 years ago in 2008, and we are dedicated to the collaborative creation of investigative theater. So, all of our work is devised by an ensemble of artists created from research, source material, historical documents, and cultural artifacts. This series is a conversation series that unites artists, activists, and experts to engage in a dialogue about gender and public policy. It's free to the public, so thank you so much for joining us. And it is running in tandem with the world premiere of our new play, No Pants in Tucson, which is currently playing at the Art New York theaters in Manhattan. This series and the production are sponsored by Supermajority Education Fund. The Supermajority Education Fund focuses on research about the role and standing of women, educates the public about issues of importance to women, and supports policies that advance women. They are making the case and building the demand for the majority rules, a set of values that, if true, women would have equality in this country. We are so thrilled to be partnering with them. Just about every single facet of this show and what we're touching on is related to those majority rules. So we'll find a way to get the link in the chat so you can check those out. And we are so grateful for their support. In part, they are underwriting the ASL interpretation this evening, which is provided by Inclusive Communication Services. And we are so grateful to have this as part of our programming. So, but next I have to tell you about No Pants in Tucson, but I would first like to welcome our guest, Lisa Merrill, Dr. Lisa Merrill.
Hi, I'm
Hello, and come on in. Come on into my studio, my broadcast room. Hi, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, and I'm glad I got to see No Pants before we're having
Yes,
conversation. We've been
you were
talking
here with us
for a long time.
Indeed. So, Lisa, you and I had the privilege of meeting at Hofstra University a number of years ago when we first brought, actually, our first play, Give Us Bread, we brought to Hofstra University, and we met then. And you were instrumental in helping us bring our not only our solo show, Artemisia's Intent, there with Professor Cindy Rosenthal, but also inviting us back to do some lectures and talking about the creation of this work. And we also had a couple of really excellent diner chats as well, which I loved about the show as we began to create it. But I do want to make sure that I give you a proper introduction. So here I go. Lisa Merrill, PhD, is Professor of Performance Studies, Rhetoric, and Public Advocacy in the Department of Writing Studies and Rhetoric at Hofstra University. Professor Merrill is a performance and cultural historian specializing in 19th century performances and social issues on stage and in the street. And she applies her research and publications about performance history and critical race and cultural studies and spectatorship to a range of cultural artifacts, artworks, and performances. And at Hofstra, you seem to be in many departments. You teach courses in performance history, women's and LGBTQ studies, performance art, nonverbal communication, performance and healing, gender and intercultural issues in communication, and you have even staged historic performance reenactments during all 3 presidential debates at Hofstra. I did not realize that. That is going to require another diner
Yes.
meeting between the two of us.
Right.
And so I just am so thrilled to have you here, and your work encompasses so much. And as soon as we started speaking, I just got like goosebumps about all the different ways in which your scholarship and your academic experiences overlap so much with the work that we were doing with No Pants in Tucson. And tonight, you're going to introduce us to so many amazing stories, some of which do overlap with the lives that are featured on the stage in No Pants in Tucson. So, for people who don't know about No Pants in Tucson, please, I'm so excited to share with you that after 3 years of development, we are live and on stage at Art New York in the Mezzanine Theater. When Mariah, our artistic associate, and when Mariah and I started brainstorming this play, and Tiffany, our programming coordinator, was at this first meeting, we just knew right away that we wanted to use these archaic, old US state laws that prohibited cross-dressing to really delve into what was happening now in a contemporary sense with assaults on reproductive rights and transgender rights. And initially, actually, it started with reproductive rights. And when we started discovering the stories behind these laws, it quickly became apparent that transgender rights were a very important part of the conversation. So, if you were not with us last Monday, we had a really great chat that you were watching, Lisa, with reproductive rights and transgender rights lawyers. It is up on our YouTube channel, so please check that out. And it was important to have a conversation about legal policy. But tonight, you and I are going to dive into the cultural policy and really like how the law plays out in a cultural sense and where it is reinforced and where it is challenged. Before we go into the conversation, is there anything important that I left out about your field of study and things that you want the audience to know about your work, which we are going to get exposed to tonight?
Well, thank you. Just the sense that I do most of my work in the archives, and hunting around in the archives is like being a CSI in the 19th
I love
century.
that.
Is finding the documents, and also looking at the absences, whose stories aren't there. A lot of my work is about race and gender and intersectionality. So what gets saved, whose stories get saved, and getting people to look at primary sources, the actual documents, not just somebody's reportage of the documents, is really important to me.
I just got like shivers on my neck because it's so exciting to hear you talk about that facet of your work and how we are employing those same ideas from a different perspective or in a different context. And so much of the creation of this play was very much about what documentation is missing, whose voices did not get documented, and why. And as we'll find out in some of the stories that we'll talk about tonight, where there is a real lack of firsthand source material. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. I'm going to check my notes to make sure that I don't need to say anything else important before we dive into those archives. I think that we are ready to go. So we're going to get that presentation set up. And it was important to me to look at all of these lives that you are going to introduce us to and start really connecting the dots between sort of what has evolved over the past 150 years and what has not, is still being challenged and fought for today.
Okay, that sounds
so
great.
Now I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. So, okay, so we're starting actually earlier than the time period that I usually live in, the 19th century. But as a performance historian, I've always been interested in people's reactions to theatricality. And so much of the anti-theatrical prejudice over time is really a prejudice against cross-dressing and against appearing to be what one isn't. So the prejudice against theater is about theater being a kind of masquerade and artifice. And of course, in theater and performance, we embrace that. But some of the claims of immorality come back to Deuteronomy. And that's why the slide that you have in front of you, and when people were charged with cross-dressing legally, goes right back to these early Judeo-Christian messages that women should not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, and neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. Of course, theater depends on people being able to do that. And when women weren't on stage, it was all men cross-dressing, right? And so before, actually, can we go back a slide? Sorry. So the other image that you have there is, I've been doing a lot of work with monuments and whose stories get told in the flesh and whose stories get told in monuments. Not far from where we are in Lenape land here is a statue of Joan of Arc, one of the few statues of women. And Joan of Arc was a cross-dresser, right? She led, so although there were these religious obstacles, Joan of Arc in male clothing was the hero saint for many people, Saint Joan. But what many people don't know is she was burned at the stake, not just for leading an army, but for cross-dressing, for violating this rule of Deuteronomy. So now we're going to jump ahead a couple of hundred years, but I just wanted to have
Just
that.
like that.
Cool sense, magic,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it shows us, it's a powerful illustration of this enduring idea of clothing being gendered,
Right.
and just this cyclical nature of this argument that we're having over and over again, disagreement about how to degender clothing, right?
Right, right. And so that connection between people who perceive theater as immoral and people who perceive cross-dressing as immoral, like the prejudice against theater, I think comes down from the very beginning to the prejudice against doing anything that changes, this notion of gender binaries and appropriate clothing. So what you see on the slide there is the actress that I've spent decades reading thousands of letters. This is Charlotte Cushman, who did play some female characters, but was mostly known as a breeches performer. That means a woman who takes on male characters. And so you see the cover of the book I wrote about her, based on 10,000 of her letters that I held in my hand when Romeo was
Wow.
in this handwriting that's almost impossible now to read. But the image that you see on the left is Cushman as Romeo and her sister Susan as Juliet. And as strange as that might seem to us now, the idea, part of the message, the rhetoric, if you will, of that visual image was that Cushman was supporting her sister. And what she says in the article that this illustration comes from is that she wanted to support her as no other man could support her, give her the support she wouldn't get from a man. Of course, this is a complete lie because Cushman had played Romeo way before her sister was on stage and continued to do it much afterward. I didn't choose that picture, though, for the cover of my book, because as you demonstrate, and I know we're going to talk about the wonderful No Pants play that you are doing as we speak, No Pants in Tucson. And you talk a lot about bifurcated clothing in that. And one of the reasons that cross-dressing was considered illegal was that you could see women's legs and the way that was eroticized. So the image that I put on the cover of the book, where Cushman is literally astride the balcony, was a shocking, almost pornographic image at the time, because remember, women even rode horses side saddle. So you never saw women's legs unless they were portraying male characters, and then usually to titillate men in the audience. So the eroticism of this violation is one of the things that Cushman played with in some ways. So,
interesting where permission is granted, right? And it is, we do have to remind ourselves how radical it was for women to be in pants and to have two legs visible, especially with our modern sensibilities, where there is so much freedom in dress and how we can dress.
Right. So you can go to the next slide. And when Cushman was performing as Romeo, she was not the first or only person on stage to take a male character. This illustration from the Illustrated London News gives, you know, this large, very masculine image. It's based on the same etching that you saw earlier. You recognize the costumes and the position somewhat. And people who saw her claimed in the letters that I read, including Queen Victoria's diary, that when they saw Cushman as Romeo, they could not tell the part was played by a woman. And this quote from People's Journal, I do not think I should have suspected her sex. Now that's before photography. So let's go to the next slide. So you see some of the reviews. Photography is invented, as some of you know, in 1839, but it's not available for on-stage performances. And for the most part, women playing male characters, even lovers of other women, were accepted to some extent. And you see some of the press of the time. This is a British paper, the Britannia. And I just chuckled when I read that females together may give us the image of desire of the lovers of Verona without suggesting a thought of vice. So this question of what is moral and what is immoral is really interesting at this moment, because Cushman was considered, and some of the actresses who played male characters were considered, they're not doing this off stage, they're playing these roles. And in fact, in this homosocial Victorian world, if men and women were as emotional and passionate as these two were, they would outrage a modern audience if they were of the opposite sex. So it tells you how we're in a different moment. Okay, now photography is invented. And remember that person who said they couldn't tell it was a woman. Well, you know, Cushman was not conventionally attractive. She's a large, butch woman, but she has breasts. And it would be hard for us to imagine contemporary audiences not reading this as a woman's body, even in clothing that, you know, showed the legs and the tunic and all of that. So I am very interested in the way people saw in earlier time periods, what they understood from what they saw. Now, Cushman's partners, go ahead, Melissa.
No, well, you know, just reminding me of so much of our work on No Pants in Tucson, we were relying on these early photographic archives where, you know, there were images captured there that, of course, we know so little about who they are, but that those individuals were not being recorded or captured in other ways, in writing, etc. And this practice also of women cross-dressing as men and taking kind of parlor photos, which we explore in the play, where one of the books, our Bible here, Women in Pants, has
Right,
so
right.
many of these photographic archives of parlor photos with women cross-dressing. Yeah.
Actually, the slide that you see is one of Cushman's partners, Matilda, sometimes calling herself Max, Matilda Hayes, who for a short time played Juliet to Miss Cushman's Romeo. And the two of them, I have another photo that I didn't include here, but it's like those parlor photos you mentioned of Cushman and Hayes together, and they are wearing matching clothes. And the clothes were described, as you see, by Elizabeth Barrett Browning as being dressed like a man down to the waist. So these two did not offstage wear trousers, although there are rumors that Cushman did, but I've not seen a photograph of her offstage doing that. But the fact that they wore these fitted waistcoats and jackets and ties signified a kind of masculine look at the time, and that was remarked upon. So here again, you see Matilda Hayes, and on the other side of the slide, also with a jacket and a tie, is the amazing sculptor Monia Lewis, who I'm doing some current work on now. And she is one of the people, she's an African-American and Native American sculptor, the first, and she came to the community that Cushman set up in Rome of women sculptors. So that sense of a supportive community of women and how people presented themselves is one of the things that I've looked at, and we're gonna do a little bit more digging as we go through these. I just wanted to mention how celebrated and accepted she was. Many people consider her the most famous woman in the English-speaking world during her lifetime. And so you see here a cigarette card that was just, again, with a sort of masculine look to Cushman. There were Cushman clubs in every major city. She was literally written out of history because of the changing understandings about lesbianism and about, I think, about intersectionality and intersex. And the various ways that Cushman was understood posthumously. But during her lifetime, she was celebrated. So just a sense of how popular she was. Now, at the same time that we have women on stage playing male characters, one of the things that, Melissa, you and I spoke about from the very beginning is how interested I am, and I think we both are, in women who cross-dress to escape enslavement, because during this time, of course, the millions of people who were enslaved, and particularly what this meant for Black women, was a significant part of, you know, the groundswell of what was happening with trying to escape by any means necessary. And so images here are one of the most famous escapes through cross-dressing. Ellen Craft and her husband, William Craft, who were both enslaved. And because Ellen Craft was so light-complected, she could pass as white. And of course, the horrors of that. I've done a lot of work on mixed race women, and, you know, look at that history and even familial history. And the mixed race woman, of course, means the rapacious effect of white male owners of those women. And it's to that we attribute what the enslaved woman here looks like. But what the two of them planned in terms of escape was not just for Ellen to pass as the white woman, but the white male owner of her own husband. And so the power dynamic there is really fascinating. And they published the narrative of their escape. and sold images, and people collected these images of Ellen Craft in top hat. There's also really interesting work in terms of disability studies because of the many horrors of enslavement. They were not allowed literacy. So they knew that if Ellen Craft were passing as a white man, he would have to sign documents. And so they presented him as someone who was injured in some way, and therefore was out of having to sign anything. Of course, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you know, so I think one of the first conversations that you and I had was about Ellen Craft and this story, and where our research really started was around this time period because we were interested in dress reform, which was the movement to get women out of corsets, out of long skirts, and into bloomers. Again, like so radical, and we touch on it in the play. Oh, women in pants. This is obscene. And you know, through the research, it became apparent very quickly that most of the stories there are of white women, and certainly middle or upper class, you know, wealthy white women. And so in spring of 2020, when we went to shelter in place, and our ensemble became a group of individual artists trying to make a play together in our own homes, we really dove into the research and were looking for these stories of women of color that were very challenging to find, depending on the time period, especially. And alongside, we're going to get to this, alongside Ellen Craft's story, there were other stories of Black women using, enslaved women using male dress in order to escape from slavery. And in our investigations, we wanted, you know, we challenged ourselves to look at these other ones because Ellen's story was documented fairly well. And there is a play that uses their story, and I cannot remember what it is. So perhaps one of our viewing audiences saw it several years ago in the city. I'm going to think of it later, and I'll put it in the chat, the link to the play. But please continue.
Yes. Well, the next slide is somebody that I think we've talked about together. Right? So this is another woman who escaped enslavement cross-dressing, and sometimes called Anna Maria Weems, sometimes Maria Weems, is one of the people who escaped enslavement on the Underground Railroad. And she and Clarissa Davis, who I know you've done some work with and that we'll talk about, know of them, again, in terms of the archival stuff, because the conductor of the Underground Railroad, who was William J. Still, kept amazing records. And so this illustration of Maria Weems
sketched this, right?
Yeah, comes from Still. Wait, we're not there yet. Okay. Comes from Still. And that we don't have an illustration of Clarissa Davis, but her escape in a box like Henry Box Brown and on a boat is something I think we're going to want to talk about, and that you're going to highlight. Yes, as we
and actually the link is right there in the Facebook chat, and we'll try and make sure that it gets on the YouTube stream too. And it's so in this period of time in spring 2020, when we were all researching and devising on our own, we started to develop as an ensemble a lot of course, recorded content, which inspired a digital series for this project. We always knew the full-length play itself would live as a in-person event, but we challenged ourselves to start creating digital content that was created safely during the pandemic and could be enjoyed by anyone during the pandemic. And so this video that you have the link to was an exploration of Clarissa's story created with the actor China Farr. And she did just a really, really remarkable job creating this experimental short film on her phone, creating the original music for it. And yes, really, there were such few details, but even out of that, she created such an evocative piece on talking about weather and how storms aided escapes because the white people wouldn't be out looking during the storm, and that was part of Clarissa's story, that she stayed hidden for 30 days or a long period of time in a box, even before she went under cover of darkness and rain to the boat to escape north. Um, and and of course, there was a lot more mobility to be had if you had a male identity.
Right.
And that is why they were disguising themselves as men. Whereas Anne Marie Weems, correct me if I'm wrong, was disguised as um, a driver of a wagon.
Right, right. And use the name Joseph Wright. I think part of the tracing is also finding the various names that historical figures, and particularly enslaved figures, whose names, many of whose names were lost to us. But Weems used the name Joseph Wright. And Clarissa Davis changed her name to Mary Armstead. So as we try and find the threads of these lives, it becomes challenging in this way, but very rewarding.
Well, I do encourage people to check out our No Pants digital series, and we're going to highlight a few other pieces there, but you can go onto that site and see some of the research material. And I believe that we sort of tried to, as you're saying, trace these names, find out where she and her family went. I believe they were in Massachusetts originally, but there are descendants of hers that now live down south that I found in a newspaper article. But really fascinating and compelling stories.
Yeah. And there's so much more that we could say about all of them, but
also, we're just scratching the surface.
Scratching the surface. What I don't have images of, and I just want to make sure that I do mention, is when I taught a course during lockdown, actually, on cross-dressing. And we spent a lot of time on people who were born female and cross-dressed to serve in the military or to be sailors. I mean, pirates, soldiers, and sailors. And some of these were people who identified as women and cross-dressed merely to serve. There were also Black women who cross-dressed and served in the Civil War. So there, Monia Lewis escaped slavery, joining the Union Army. I've not been able to find any photograph of her, so I haven't included her here. But she used the name George Harris, and we only know about her because a man who helped her, who's a white man who served in the same unit, his sister kept a diary after the Civil War, so we know about her. And Lizzie Hoffman was another Black woman who joined the U.S. Colored Infantry, disguised as a man. But again, we don't have photographs. So there's a different sort of tracing. And of course, these women who escaped enslavement. The other thing that I was focusing on, and that you touch on so beautifully in No Pants, I'm going to do all my pitches for No Pants. I've seen it.
I appreciate it.
Not only have I talked to you about it in development stages years ago, just being in the theater last night and seeing what you all accomplished was wonderful. And
I still can't even believe it. Feels a little surreal that it actually finally happened. And also in the digital series, I did want to mention we have two videos, they're video explorations. One about Private Cathay Williams, And that story was from 1854. That was an exploration that our costume designer did. And another experimental film inspired by Loretta Velasquez, who disguised herself as a man during the
So,
Civil War, and that was created by Tess Rodriguez. So please do check both of those pieces out. They're so unique and fascinating.
yeah, that's great. And there are some lovely photos of Velasquez, actually. So there are images to trace there. So that's great. I know that you are interested in and talk about Dr. Mary Walker, who you see photographed here. And Dr. Walker was always identified herself as female. So she's not a passing or a trans woman, but she was very active in both the dress reform movement and the suffrage movement, and attended medical school and served in the Union Army as a physician. Volunteered first because she wasn't officially given that position, although she was a licensed physician. But she said that women's clothing, she wrote a whole treatise about the danger of women's clothing, and particularly for somebody doing medical work. So she was harassed, she was arrested at times, but she functioned as a very famous physician, one of the first doctors. So the cross-dressing was a big part of how she was known. And I think you can say more about what you've chosen to do in terms of having somebody embody the work of Dr. Walker.
She's such a compelling figure. And it's been just really exciting for us to explore her. And she's probably the most prominent historical figure that we have in the play, and certainly the one that we have the most source material from, because she was a prolific writer and speaker, and something that her story ties together is both this role of gender within the medical community, and also her role as a suffragist and in attempting to win the right to vote, for women to vote. And there are stories that we have found mention of that are the same time period of her, of Black women dressing as men in order to go vote. And just being able to look at that from a perspective of voter suppression, which we might think is just, it's just interesting to see it now being played out in vastly different ways. And yeah, her story really ties together these different threads. But I always appreciated how she was very insistent that she was not wearing men's clothing. She was wearing her own clothing. She was very confident and assured about that. And I love, there's so many images of her too, which is so great. So just go to Google and look for them, and just watching the progression is really fascinating.
It's interesting.
And also,
I'm sorry.
Well, I just saw a comment from Sydney on YouTube, and I so appreciate it, because it was one of the things, they're bringing up something that we wanted to talk about, which is, so I'm just going to read it out loud. When examining historical figures and their gender through a modern lens, where do you think the center of the Venn diagram is? Thank you. That's part one. And part two, between gender and cross-dressing, do you think it's right as modern historians for us to speculate on the gender and gender identities of historical figures? I was jumping ahead because we are supposed to do Q&A at the end, but that question really, was something that we've been paying attention to and asking in our process. And I know that you do as well. And we talked earlier today about language and the limitation of language, in that these contemporary terms of transgender, non-binary, gender fluid are contemporary. And that terminology did not exist in the mid to late 1800s, where a lot of these stories are coming from.
Right.
And I find it very nuanced because there were so many limitations placed on women from a perspective of career opportunities and education and earning money to be independent or to take care of one's family, that it is very nuanced, this idea of cross-dressing for women, that sometimes it was for career opportunities, sometimes it was for gender expression, and even further gender identity. But it is um, nearly impossible to be able to decipher in so many of these stories how these people would identify by today's vocabulary.
Well, I wanted to make a comparison with Dr. Walker. So, one last thing about Dr. Walker, and this may speak to Sydney's question too. So, Dr. Walker married a man, was born female, always identified as female, as radical female. When she was married, she wore a short dress over pants. So even in her marital clothes, I haven't seen a picture of that. But if you look at the next slide, we're going back a little bit, and this is Dr. James Miranda Barry, who was also born female, assigned female at birth, but lived his entire life as a man. So his dates are a little bit earlier. He was born in 1789 and dies by 1865. And he's English, and goes to medical school in Edinburgh at a time that, as a female, that would have been impossible. Comes from a privileged enough family that they're able to give him a backstory, and goes to school dressed as a man, and lives as a man for the rest of his life. He's a well-known surgeon in the British Army. Sorry, you're hearing some
It's New York. It's New York City. It's a live New York City event.
Right. And James Miranda Barry's biological sex is only discovered posthumously. No one with whom he served in the British Army, or in his medical practice, had any idea that James Barry, was biologically anything but male, and would certainly, although trans is not a language they had then, wouldn't make that distinction between people who cross-dressed for an occupational reason, and people who chose to live in their male identity. And so that's why I wanted to compare these two remarkable doctors.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And here this speaks to one of the things that we've said earlier, the kind of outrage and ridicule for women wearing anything like what we would call trousers or pants. Of course, it's Amelia Bloomer who gives them the name bloomers. And it's important to realize that comes out of the white women's suffrage movement. I'm preparing a class on race and gender and suffrage, and highlighting what happened to Black women in the suffrage movement. So what you were saying about voter suppression is very much on my mind about that. But the sense of what would happen for people who had the audacity to wear what you in the play are talking about, and what they called at the time bifurcated clothing, that was more radical even than the idea of suffrage. So it's hard for people to realize how, but think about it, goes back to Deuteronomy, right? It's and as you say in the play, this notion that this is immoral, that there's something inherently indecent and immoral about cross-dressing.
Right, and that women in pants is like crossing this line into a male territory, and then we have to think about what that territory covers. Work, social standing, property ownership, the right to vote, and yeah, you can see why it was such a fraught issue to see women trying to eschew their very feminine garments.
Right. And part of what these cartoon illustrations do is show how classed this whole phenomenon was as well. So in other work that I've published, the experience of slum tourism as a performative experience for privileged white bourgeois people who would go into impoverished neighborhoods, comment on the clothing that was worn, and the desperation of people who trying to earn a living by whatever means they could. So part of the radical nature of that there. So now we're looking at a different kind of classed experience, actually. And what you see here are the higher sisters. And these were remarkable singers. They were sisters, biological sisters. Anameta Hires and her sister Emma Louise Hires, who sang opera and concert songs, very much a kind of cultural capital, the privileged music, like opera. And they did a lot of duets in male and female couples. So again, we have these two sisters. Emma Louise always played and sang the male role. So she had the ability to do that. And Anameta always sang the high soprano notes. So they were coming out of the whole notion of a kind of oral drag, as I have here, and the sense that women could take on the role of Black male leads as well. And because they're doing this very class privileged kind of performance, they're maintaining their respectability. And this is really an issue for all working people, but particularly Black women. So I just want to shout out some of Brittany Cooper's amazing work on Black the pressure to perform respectability, and how that dovetails with this question of cross-dressing, which in many cases is seen as, not what privileged classes do, except in opera, because opera always has the principal boy played by a female singer who can take on that role. So that sense of what genres of performance encourage cross-dressing, and what the kind of frisson for audience, the homoeroticism that's present in that. And I think that was very much the case with the higher sisters. Now I want to, as we're winding down some, expand the Americas some, because getting just out of the United States to recognize this is the most famous person in the Mexican Revolution, but not the only person who was born assigned female at birth and then lived a male life, or at least cross-dressed to be part of the Mexican Revolution. There are a number of new books about the roles of women as soldiers in the Mexican Revolution. Not all of them were cross-dressed. Some of them took up arms and participated in various ways. But Emilio Robles, Robles Avilla, in the Spanish, Robles is the father's name and the patrimony, how he was known. But Emilio Robles lived a male life once, shortly after the first time that he cross-dressed, became a very active and important part of the national defense. And as you see, he lived a long life till 1984. It's just amazing to think of that. And he was particularly proud of the fact, as you see, I kind of lifted that out here, that he was recognized as a veterano, the male veteran, by the Mexican Secretary of National Defense, because women who took up arms in the Mexican Revolution were not necessarily regarded as male. So this is somebody who not just cross-dressed, but lived this life. And one of my favorite people I have discovered in doing this research is Luisa Capitillo, who is an incredible labor activist and free love advocate. Again, this is somebody who always identified as female, but chose to wear men's clothing, and for that was arrested. And there are all kinds of accounts of the many times that she was arrested. So I use the pronoun she for her because she wrote really eloquently both about women's free love and about the ability and necessity as an organizer to dress as she chose. And what she chose was to wear what were considered male clothing. And one of my students is now, actually I have a number of students who have performed as Luisa Capitillo. So fascinating to think about the labor organizing, because being a woman labor organizer in Puerto Rico is already a remarkable thing. And it's in 1915 that she was arrested in Cuba. So think about how early that is.
And I'm so struck by that image that says trouserettes, and talking again about language, this other piece of identifying clothing that the women were wearing. Like, we couldn't call them pants or trousers. They're always this diminutive or feminized term, trouserettes or bloomers, or they've got to have a completely different name, right? Despite the fact that the wearer is fully capable of, you know, it doesn't match the person who's wearing the clothing.
Right. And especially in this case, right? Because as you see, she was outspoken, identified as a feminist, an anarchist, a journalist, a labor union leader, and an organizer who wrote widely about the connection between sexual freedom and women's desires. She wrote very, very bluntly about women's desire. And again, from Puerto Rico, and connecting that to her labor activism and her self-presentation. And you know, that's one of the many things about her that I think is just fascinating. Whatever the norms were for women of the time, she wanted to expand all of that. So for her, I think the cross-dressing was part of the many radical things that she did. I spent a lot of time when I was teaching the cross-dressing course, and we just have a little bit of time now. So I just mentioned briefly Harlem Renaissance and the amazing many women in the Harlem Renaissance who used drag performance, performed in drag shows. And Gladys Bentley was one of the people who was most known, both in terms of the way she chose to present herself and the very sexual, erotic nature of her songs, and the fact that she was openly living with and singing to other women. So many of the Harlem Renaissance singers like Bentley, I mean, Bentley was probably the best known of them, who drew audiences who were coming to hear the range of things that she did. So it wasn't just the clothing. It was clearly she was living what we would call a lesbian life. Although sadly, something happened at the very end of her life, sad to me, maybe not to her, where she seemed to have turned her back on all of that. There's a clip of her on the Groucho Marx show, And she marries a man and, reverts to wearing a dress at the very end of her life. So it's impossible to know what motivated that choice, because again, the public nature of that after a whole life of living and cross-dressing and living a life with other women. So she's a really remarkable character.
Gladys Bentley is someone that we did a little bit of research on and explored, although we were very clear from the beginning that we really, for our purposes, for our play, we wanted to focus on the lives of people outside of the context of performance.
Right.
Although the idea of the breeches role and the cross-dressing performer was very much an influence in how we created the play and the tone for the play. But we were nonetheless exploring this idea of the performance of gender through clothing and what clothing could offer, what clothing can reveal. And it's been a fascinating journey exploring that question.
And the way you stage that, the notion of getting rid of the corsetry and all of that in No Pants is really beautifully done. Amazing costume switches very quickly.
Many costumes.
Yes.
We are very fortunate to have a wardrobe supervisor, our wardrobe supervisor, Bailey Wilson, behind the scenes, helping everybody change so quickly as we cycle through different lives of different decades. Because our play spans from about the 1850s with Dr. Mary Walker all the way up through 1943 with Jackie Bross. And then, of course, we do bring in this contemporary piece, but in terms of the historical figures that we've been exploring. And yes, we are premiering. We just had our opening weekend, and we have 1 week of performances left. So if you haven't seen the show yet, we do hope you will check that out and see some of these very people portrayed in the play. Is this the time? Yeah, you have one more slide?
And then we can open to everybody.
Great.
Okay, so the last person here, Stormy DeLavery, is the only one that I actually met, although I had no idea at the time of Stormy's backstory. Stormy DeLavery was a drag performer, bouncer, and considered by many the person who started she's a Stonewall icon. Some people say that she started the Stonewall riot. She was as you see, the MC of the Jewel Box Review. So she did cross-dressing with a group of men dressed in drag, right? So they were dressed M to F, and she was F to M. But she, it was as a bouncer at a bar that I won't even remember the name of, to note how young I was at the time, that everybody would...
Were you legal? Were you sneaking in there?
I was sneaking in.
Underage? I love it.
Toward this amazing bouncer who I didn't know at the time was a famous drag performer in her own right. And there's a lovely new documentary about Stormy. She was really a remarkable person, and so she's known now mostly as the person who led the Stonewall,
which is actually like a beautiful tie-in to our play, because part of the impetus for Stonewall was that the police were using this ordinance that people who were wearing, more than 3 articles of clothing of the opposite sex, and that was the pretense that they used to go and break up, bust that bar.
Right.
So and we see how we're looking at ordinances that proliferated in the late 1800s, but some even were being set in the early half of the 1900s. But they, even when they were banned, or they just kept morphing into something else. And most recently, I believe it was February of this year, that Governor Cuomo did undo the what was commonly known as the walking while trans law, which again was an anti-loitering law, but the way that the police used it was to identify people based on their clothing, and to arrest them. And so this law was most frequently used to target transgender women of color.
Right.
And I have a question that I'm going to pose, and we're not going to answer quite yet, because I also want to encourage the audience, our viewing audience. Thank you. If you have questions, please pop them in the chat now. But I do want us to talk a bit about, like, what is this cost of policing bodies for not performing the gender that they were born as, or as the culture sees them as. So we're gonna think on that for a moment, but this is the portion of our event where we show some digital content, and I am so excited to share with our audience this piece called Disorderly Joy, that was created and performed by Kiana Alexander, based on the story of Sarah Bell from 1904, who was a woman in North Carolina who was arrested for wearing pants. And this piece just premiered last month as part of our round 2 of the digital series. So I'm going to let our backstage technician set this up. We'll watch this and we'll come back to finish our conversation.
Great. While she's setting it up, let me just say I didn't mention about Stormy.
Oh, sorry, we missed that last little bit that you were saying, Lisa.
Oh, just that we'll talk more about the way mixed race identities also violate the binary, the gender binary. And so Stormy very much identified as a mixed race woman. So a butch lesbian, mixed race butch lesbian. So yeah, we'll unpack that at another point.
There's a lot there.
See this lovely video.
Yes, thank you. So Disorderly Joy by Kiana Alexander. Oh, you know what? I realized this was the behind the scenes making of this film and not the actual one. So we're gonna pop the link in here so that people can go to our website and view it on YouTube. But you can see we had, this was exciting because we had artists from outside of New York creating work. And this is Kiana, who made a beautiful, beautiful movement-based piece inspired by this story. So we'll see if we can pull it up in a minute, the actual one, but we're going to take this one out and share the link. But let's see if we have questions, and I'm going to see if I can find the right link for that beautiful video, because I do want audience to see it. And Zelda, yes, this program is being recorded, so we will share out the link afterwards, and people can absolutely take a look at this, especially after they've seen the show and they want to go in deeper. But we encourage you to ask other questions from the audience, and we'll pop them up on the screen. But this is the question that we've been interested in. What is the cost of policing bodies? What is lost by the policing of non-gender conforming bodies, of bodies that aren't easily identifiable or categorized, as you were mentioning?
Right. And certainly, I think part of the draw of how clothing is part of that. I also want to push how space is part of that. because where these non-binary bodies are seen, this question of public spaces being policed, you know, Claire Sears has done a wonderful job about the policing of lesbian bars in, yep, in San Francisco.
And
There
you
you
can see this well documented or
yeah,
well
yeah,
tagged book.
yeah,
And even this, you know, she does a beautiful job talking about how the stories out of that time period in that area of the country are limited because of the fires in San Francisco,
right,
that a lot of court records were lost to those fires.
right. And I'm really interested in the tension between a bar scene like that, which is a gathering place and a gathering place for lesbians and for people who, you know, identify anywhere on a fluid spectrum, and the fact that at the same time there are cross-dressing dime performances. There are people like Vesta Tilley and Annie Hindle. There are well-known music box shows where there are cross-dressed performers and people are coming to see that. So that sense of what's allowed on stage and what's allowed in other public aspects of people's lives.
And Lisa, you know, one of the this is making me think about Ralph Carwinio,
Yes.
who is another figure that we spent a lot of time exploring. And there's a beautiful video, a short film that we made with Marissa Joyce Stamps, who is in the full production. And this was an exploration of Ralph Carwinio's life.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, this was someone who was assigned female at birth,
Mm-hmm.
lived as a woman for many years, and for uh, several nuanced reasons, began to identify as a man to get a better job, to be able to live
Mm-hmm.
with a woman, live with his wife,
Mm-hmm.
and then until he was outed. But it was after that, when he became a tabloid sensation, that then he was invited in to become a vaudeville performer.
Yes.
So there's such an interesting connection there, where then, because someone was stigmatized and
Mm-hmm.
criminalized, that the for how they presented, that the only way they had to make a living then was to be performing some version of themselves.
Right, right. And, you know, I do a lot of work on spectatorship. So I'm always thinking about what is the dialogue with the spectator? You know, how much is the eroticism of cross-dressing or recognizing, you know, what is arousing to a spectator in seeing and knowing what are the bodies under those clothes, right? And who's drawn to that. And I think, you know, this comes back to the anti-theatrical prejudice and the questions also of what happens when you don't fit into easily identifiable categories of race or gender. And
Mhm.
who finds that exciting, who finds that threatening, who decides to police that, and obviously in the interests of, you know, white supremacy and how that all plays out. Carwinio is a fascinating character. Actually, we did work on him in my cross-dressing class. And, you know, he was born in 1876, the same year that Cushman died. So the idea of what was acceptable during her life and then after her death, not acceptable anymore. And Carwinio just being born at that moment. So there's a nationalizing narrative that's really interesting there, and a mixed race narrative as well.
Yes, yes, because Cora Anderson, that was the birth name,
Mhm.
was African American and Indigenous American. And
Right,
when Cora assumed the identity of Ralph Carwinio, presented himself as South American,
right,
Bolivian.
right.
Um, yeah. Oh, another great question from Sydney. I know it's hard to speculate, but do you believe that the intersection of presentation and sexuality is a bigger factor than jobs when women cross-dressed?
Yes. Yes, Sydney.
Short answer,
Short
yes.
answer, yes, yes. And I think this question of being able to create a life with a same-sex partner is a really significant part of many of the stories of people whose whole lives, this wasn't when it was not just, and I don't mean to diminish the work of people like Mary Walker, who's, or people who escaped enslavement, like Ellen Craft, and then as soon as they escaped, resumed female identities. I do want to say that Ellen Craft, as white appearing as she was, always embraced her Black identity. And I think that that's so important to recognize while we're looking at always, the horrors of colorism, to recognize the celebration of Black heritage, even if it's not visible. So yes, Sydney has another question here about.
Sydney came prepared, and I want to have like a long dinner with Sydney, untangling all of this.
Yes.
Here we go. Have you done any work on cross-dressing when people are from non-European cultures, or how colonialism affects gendered clothing?
Yes. Yes, and Sydney and I can talk at some point as well. We should definitely, and Sydney needs a ticket to the show, I think.
Well, we're gonna work on that.
Okay, good. Yes, there's a famous Japanese theater company called Takarazuka that is an all-female company that plays very conventional romantic stories. And all the male parts, of course, are played by women. And so they have fans all over. This is a very mainstream, celebrated phenomenon in Japan. So I think it's obviously, this is just a small example. Sydney, you were saying, looking for an example of the non-European cultures. But I think it's obviously a much more complicated phenomenon to look at, and that's a performance company. So I haven't done work on people who have cross-dressed in other cultures, not on stage. So I've just done some of the on-stage work. But I think the question about colonialism is really important, because we have to think also of three-spirit people, indigenous people, many cultures for whom this binary is not only doesn't exist, but that the person who would be considered either more fluid or not part of the binary is celebrated rather than policed. And so, the Deuteronomy thing comes very much to Judeo-Christian tradition, but I haven't explored it further back in terms of a wider cultural experience. But I think your question about colonialism is really important, because part of that, the many horrors of colonialism is really about an imposition of the binaries, right? The worldview of the colonizer being thrust on the colonized, and then what it take to resist that. It's a profound question.
And thinking about the stage and these stories on the stage, Peter, yes, they are interesting and rich stories, and it's amazing that Hollywood and Broadway hasn't turned them into more films and plays. And that's probably been one of the most thrilling parts of, I'll speak on behalf of the Anthropologists, of creating No Pants in Tucson, is being able to pull these stories out of the footnotes and to put them on stage. And some of them have been covered widely, like the lives of Dr. Mary Walker, but others, like Mrs. Alice Carter. And I'm looking at all my sticky notes, that we have this like couple, this duo, Alice and Mary, who we only know from one little newspaper article talking about an arrest, where we have to fill in a lot of the details and by context clues, and just trying to imagine what kind of lives they were living, that they were trying to live, before they got the law was used against them. Well, this is the perfect timing. We have the actual real video ready to go. So we're going to show that video of called Disorderly Joy.
Okay.
And there is actually sound that goes with this video. We were just having some technical difficulties. So this just means that you're going to have to go and watch the real thing on YouTube. And this again was based on this story of Sarah Bell, just one newspaper article that we know nothing more about Sarah Bell, but Key did a beautiful job of summoning generations of women's voices who might be able to speak on behalf of Sarah Bell. Lisa, I could talk to you all night about this, and unfortunately we have to wrap up, but this has been so fascinating. Even with all of this research that I've done on this play, there's just so much more that I got out of tonight, and I feel like there's at least 8 more plays inside this conversation that we just had.
Yes, and I love Peter Marino's question about that. For years, I've said, Charlotte Cushman, I have 10,000 letters. You know, the idea of people who, that moment when it was possible, and then afterward when it was no longer possible. Just that moment was so fascinating to see, because the love letters from other women who saw her as Romeo are just fascinating to look at the same time that, you know, there are eulogies from the church praising these women, and then they're written out of history completely. So that sense of policing the body, I think, is so fascinating. And yes, these stories need to be told. They need to be performed in the wonderful ways that the anthropologists do their performances. And I love the, you know, the background work of finding some of the narratives and then seeing what you bring to the stage. So it's a pleasure for me as well.
Well, thank you so much. We just benefited so much from your expertise and your studies, and I am so grateful that we could have this conversation. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us tonight. We'll put some links in the chat too, with links to your books and other scholarship. And please do consider getting tickets for No Pants in Tucson. Performances begin again on Wednesday, November 10th, and that performance will feature live ASL interpretation provided by Inclusive Communication Services, and we are so grateful for that. That is also through a grant from Art New York, and we're thrilled to make that possible. So please do spread the word, buy tickets for that. And thank you so much for joining us at Resetting the Table, episode 3.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good night, everyone.
Yes.